So, you've decided to buy FTK2. Well, you must enjoy suffering. This game needs no introduction. Obviously, you've played the game or know about it since you've clicked on this video. But welcome to the cruel and unforgiving world of Fahrul, filled with tricks, traps, and a whole lot of pain. Jumping right into it, let's talk about the grid. The 4x2 squares that your characters are placed on seemingly randomly whenever you engage in a fight in FTK2. This is a new feature that brings a crazy new dynamic to the game that just didn't exist in the first game. In FTK1, you selected how your characters would line up when you started an adventure, and that's how they would stay forever until you died or somehow you won. In FTK2, your up to 4 characters are able to move around this 4x2 grid, and I see a lot of new and also returning players confused as to how this works and what strategy is around the character placement and movement. So that's why I'm here today. I'm here to talk about that grid and what you should be doing. First, let's cover the easy stuff. Characters that are equipped with shields can protect the character standing directly behind them. This is shown when the tile behind a character with a shield has a blue shield surrounding it. This means that the character in the back can only be indirectly targeted by enemies. They can still get hit by AoE and splash damage, but they cannot be targeted directly while standing behind a character with a shield. Next, the tiles themselves can be attacked and have elemental effects and debuffs applied to them. You sort of don't encounter this until the later game, but some of the weapons can, for example, cause an enemy to burn, and some can cause a tile to burn, meaning if an enemy remains in that tile for a full turn, they will incur the effect of that tile's debuff. Tile effects do not stack, but status effects on enemies can, meaning a tile cannot be both shocked and on fire, but you could apply these effects to the enemies themselves. Pro tip, if an enemy attacks a tile you're standing in, and applies a debuff to that tile, like a shock, confuse, burn, poison, what have you, you can use a purify scroll to cleanse that tile and remove the debuff. Now let's move into how enemies attack. There are 3 primary ways you're going to get attacked in FTK2. Sometimes you might get single target stabbed or shot with an arrow, something like that. As it sounds, it means only one of your characters are going to take damage here. You can also get single targeted attacked by an attack that also has splash damage. My goodness, that was painful to say. A lot of the larger enemies with heavier attacks can do this, meaning if your characters are all clumped up in a corner, a single target splash damage attack can do a lot of damage to your team all at once. Finally, there are AoE attacks. These attacks are specifically targeted to a specific area on the grid. These are the attacks that can typically cause tile debuffs I was talking about earlier. What makes these attacks different from single target splash is that you can target enemy tiles for AoE attacks, giving you a lot more flexibility to attack multiple enemies if they're spread out. With single target splash, you must launch an attack at an enemy occupied tile. The splash damage profile is of 2 shapes. First, in this Tetris T-shape kind of thing, and the second is if the enemy is in a corner, it's this like 2x1 corner shape. So that's the basics of tile mechanics, and so now let's get into some stances. So I coined this one the Ziggity Ziggity. This stance is pretty simple. You zigzag your characters one in front of the other, front and back. This allows you to avoid splash damage from all single target splash attacks based on the damage profile we just discussed. I did forget to mention that there's not a one size fits all, one layout fits all for this game. Your layout should be based around what enemies you're fighting and what attacks they can do. The Ziggity layouts leaves your characters exposed to single target attacks because they're sort of staggered, right? And typically magic characters have high resistance to magic attacks with low armor. Physical characters are usually the opposite, meaning the Ziggity shape, you're not taking advantage of your characters with shields. And if you're fighting a lot of enemies that are doing physical attacks, it leaves your magic characters exposed. So again, this isn't one of those one layout fits all. It's just a great layout sort of to go to if you don't know what you're doing. This is also a great layout if you know you're fighting enemies that can do a lot of single target splash. Something like a warlock that can do splash bleed, something you really want to avoid. I really couldn't find footage from my recordings of me using this strategy. I don't typically use it all that often, only because as your characters are spread across the grid sort of randomly when you go into a fight, it's not really feasible to go for this sort of layout just because of how the characters are placed initially. And also the way that I like to play the game, or like to play the game so far, is I really like to take advantage of shields and taunting. And so if I'm doing this zigzag strategy, I'm not taking advantage of that. So I just typically don't play it much. But sometimes you see enemies in this stance. You know, if you are playing in a way where, for example, you don't have a shield, maybe you're using two-handed weapons, this is a really good thing to try. The next layout I wanted to talk about is what I'll call the split. This one's pretty self-explanatory. You split your characters up into groups of 2 and place them on the opposite sides of the board. The purpose here is to try to minimize the amount of AoE damage you're taking. AoE attacks like Arrow Storm or Magic Storm hit an area of 3 by 2 on the grid. And in this formation, it means you only take damage on 2 of your characters in the same turn. The same is true about attacks that cause debuffs to tile. Here in this formation, the split, you'll only take tile debuffs on 2 of your characters in a single turn. Again, not too much into the combat strategy here, but it's ideal if you attack your high vitality and armor resistance characters together if you can. Again, it depends on how your characters are initially spread out on the grid. These characters together paired with taunt help minimize the amount of damage you take overall. The last layout is what I'll call the shun. Here we've placed our character to taunt in a corner. The point here is simple, to allow your high vitality character to just sit in a corner as far away from the rest of your team as possible to take all the attacks, while none of your other characters receive any other kind of damage. The reason you'd want to do this layout if you know you're facing characters or enemies that do a lot of AoE damage in a 2 by 2 square. Magic Imps is a good example of a lot of enemies that you'll face that can do this. Another strategy I employed here was I had to fight a troll, and so based on how the characters were spread initially on the board, it was easiest for me to just move my blacksmith into the corner and push everyone else onto the other side, just having my blacksmith taunting, taking all of the damage, while the other 3 characters just applied the damage to the troll. So there you have it. Hopefully you've learned something about the FTK2 grid. This is really basic stuff, and remember the layouts I've shared are just good general go-to layouts if you can. Your characters enter a fight scattered randomly across the grid, so it might not be feasible for you to get into the layout that you want, so you'll need to improvise. Another thing I didn't mention was that some weapons can only launch attacks from the first row. Heavy swords and polearms are like this, where if they're in the back row or sitting behind another character, you won't be able to attack. Learning what type of layout you should aim for is heavily dependent on what kind of attacks you'll be up against. You'll eventually learn what kind of attacks enemies will go for just from playing the game more. You'll realize that archers either like to use single target or arrow storm, that warlocks like to do splash damage bleed, and so on. Finally, there's also a lot of mechanics I didn't talk about, like pierce or row attacks, but this is meant to be beginner friendly. Most of the stuff I talked about in the video today is what you'll encounter in like the first 2 chapters. So get out there and experiment with your character placement. You'll find some layouts are better than others based on how you play, and sometimes you won't even need to move at all. It's just entirely based on what you're up against. If you found this helpful, let me know down below. I've also been streaming this game on Twitch, so feel free to drop in and say hi. If you want more videos like this, please let me know. I'm still learning the game myself, but I like to share my thoughts and ideas on topics I see new players struggle with. Anyways, thanks as always for watching.